On today's Business Insights podcast, I'm pleased to be joined by Kevin Gardiner and Rhys Thomas to discuss Competitive, the second of a series of Cardiff Capital Region State of the Nation reports. Welcome, gentlemen.
Thank you, Mark.
Thanks, Mark.
Before we begin, would you mind providing our listeners with a brief introduction to yourselves and your role specifically within the Cardiff Capital Region, please?
Well, I'll kick off, if I may. It's Kevin Gardiner, and I'm an economist based in the City of London. I've worked in the city for a long time, started off at the Bank of England, and subsequently worked for a number of investment banks. My current role is as an economist and an investment advisor. Now, I grew up in Cardiff, and a couple of years ago, I was asked to play a role in the Growth Commission, which was looking into how we might think about industrial strategy around the city deal. And I'm currently a member of the Economic Partnership, and that's exactly the function that we're providing. We're looking at how should we best invest these funds to make the most of public sector's money in terms of sustainable growth in prosperity.
I'm Rhys Thomas, and I'm the Chief Operating Officer for the Cardiff Capital Region City Deal. I've been in post for the last 3 or 4 months, and prior to that I was at Cardiff University for approximately 15 years, working on their innovation and business engagement strategy, involved in the relationship between the university and IQE. That was the starting of the Compound Semiconductor Initiative and the cluster in the region, plus the Innovation Campus development on Maindy Road.
Competitiveness is the theme of the second report that is about to be released. Before we discuss some of the detail that's in the reports, can you remind our listeners why this series of reports was commissioned in the first place, and what's the overriding objective of this second report?
The reports were originally commissioned because up until now, I don't think we've ever had a full overview of the region from an economic, social and wider perspective. So this is really the first opportunity and in essence maybe a baseline for where we are as a city region at the outset of the city deal. The local authorities will understand their patch inside out. They will have a deep understanding of the transport challenges and opportunities, the economic ones, the environmental and social and so on. And there will be a small cohort of individuals that may have a good overview of, for example, transport at a regional level, but not have the wider understanding of how that relates with the economy, and how that may lead to some environmental challenges and the social and educational elements. So the purpose of these reports really was to give that overview, and we've split them down into 3 parts. The connected versions that's already been issued. The second part is competitive, and there will be a third edition in due course around the resilience of the region. So what are we hoping to achieve from this report, the competitive one, is really just to have a better understanding of competitiveness of our economy, what our innovation capacity is, and what our skill base is, and where we are currently, and maybe where we need to look in the future for further opportunity to develop.
Looking at the region from outside, one of the frustrations for me as an economist who spends most of his time outside the Cardiff Capital Region is trying to work out what's going on in the region. How does it all add up? How does it all fit together? Because the data, to date at least, haven't been as coherent and as complete as they could be. So this is an attempt to fill that gap, really.
Absolutely, and it is a first attempt at it, really. This will be an evolving piece going forward.
And Kevin, how important is competitiveness in terms of improving the economic prosperity of the region?
Oh, tremendously important, because you can think of competitiveness in a way as a way of summarising how sustainable, in an economic sense, the projects and businesses that we're looking to invest in might be. A competitive project, a competitive business is able to stand on its own 2 feet. It doesn't have to worry about suddenly being undercut or outproduced by other suppliers elsewhere, but it's got a market niche and a market share which is relatively stable, and that's tremendously important. Not all of the city deal's objectives are commercial, but for those which are, investing in competitively sustainable enterprises is probably very important indeed. It's a little bit of a difficult issue to get your teeth into because, as you might guess, anything to do with economics, it can be very difficult to measure these things. There are lots of different facets to competitiveness: prices, costs, the quality, the character of the products and services that you're supplying. But as a notion, it's central to the idea of investment which will deliver a lasting boost to prosperity, not just a one-off sugar rush.
Let's talk about GVA in particular, one of the key measures, obviously, of economic prosperity. What is the Cardiff Capital Region trend data telling us?
It's telling us that the region it's been growing. GVA has been improving at very varying paces across the region, of course, but it's been growing and improving at levels which are still lagging some way behind the average levels for the UK as a whole. And not just the UK as a whole, but for the UK excluding London, because London is rather special in many ways economically. But Cardiff, the region, is lagging behind the other parts of the UK a little also. Now, you can put a positive spin on that from a competitive perspective, because what it's telling you effectively is that the wages and costs here in the region are relatively low by comparison to wages elsewhere in the UK. So if competitiveness can be thought of in terms of being pretty cheap, inexpensive, then the region is pretty well placed to do that. Its wages, its property prices, these things make it potentially quite an attractive destination in which to do business. But that mustn't be the only measure of competitiveness that you're using, because ideally we want to be producing things which actually deliver higher wages, not lower wages, and it's not a sustainable competitive strategy to try to outcompete China, for example, in terms of prices and costs only. So that low GVA data is telling us that we've got a cost advantage to begin with, but we have to be very much aware that there must be much more to competitiveness than that, because we're looking to try to grow our way out of that particular cost advantage.
And Rhys, how do we compare with other city regions, and why is that so important?
Well, I think as Kevin said, we've got a low cost base, so at the moment our GVA numbers are relatively low in terms of output, but they have been growing, and they've been growing at a reasonably steady rate over the last 10 years or so. So the economy is moving in the right direction. Maybe the speed and the pace of that growth isn't quite what we would like it to be, and the output isn't quite there. And I think that feeds back to what Kevin has just said in many ways, that we've got a low cost base. A lot of the jobs are not as highly paid as they could be. Arguably, they're not as high adding value as they could be. But I think we are seeing that movement in the economy over the recent years. And, and I think the emerging fintech cluster is a good example of that, where in the financial services, whereas a decade ago, the jobs that we were getting in that sector were back office, customer service roles, lower skill, lower level. So I think things are evolving. And when you compare ourselves to the rest of the, it is important to remember our marketplace, I guess, and that's why we need to do the comparison. We are operating in a global perspective, but even in a UK context, we are competing against the other core cities and the core city regions across the UK, and our performance is in the middle of the pack in those areas. And we need to hopefully improve on that.
What changes have we seen over the last few years in terms of demand shift in types of employment? Which are the standout growth occupations?
Again, probably picking back on what the last point around the financial services and the fintech area, we are seeing a growth in demand for the underlying capabilities that drive such an economy, a sector, which is sort of your data science, your software engineering, your cyber analytics. So those key digital enabling skill set is an area that there's emerging growth. The growth in absolute numbers is getting there, but in terms of percentage growth, it is actually growing quite quickly at the moment. Manufacturing is another area where there is still strong demand. We are seeing that changing, I think, and I think we are seeing a change from the low heavy manufacturing to more of the high value added manufacturing, where the compound semiconductor cluster is a good example of that growth that we're starting to see. And the trajectory for them going forward does look very positive, and hopefully we need to work with others in supporting that and making sure that comes through and to fruition. In terms of the wider skills area, there's still a big demand really for foundational skills that keep the economy going around social care, social services. The wider public sector is still a big employment opportunity in the region. I think over time, it would be a strong sign of growth if that dependency of the public sector was less.
No, I'd agree. I think what I find quite encouraging about the region's occupational and jobs growth, looking at it again from the outside, is that it's not entirely dominated by one particular sector. And we know from the point of view of the City deal that we mustn't put all our eggs in one basket. And we certainly need those high-tech manufacturing companies, but high-tech, high productivity often means low employment creation, and we need those jobs too. So I think a mix of manufacturing and services, high-tech alongside foundational skills, is very much the way to be going.
And Kevin, what significance does this have for our region?
Well, it's encouraging that we are seeing a reasonably widespread pattern of growth across industries and across skill sets. There is still work to be done for sure, and one of the things which comes out of the report is that across the region, although the number of people without a qualification in terms of skills is falling, which is good, it still varies tremendously. So there are still pockets within the region where, sadly, a lot of workers don't have any qualifications. So there is still certainly work to be done. And I think, too, in terms of business formation, very difficult to get plausible data for that. We've had a go, but there's always room for improvement there. And one of the things that we need to think very carefully about is how easy it is to get a business up and running in the region compared to how easy it might be elsewhere.
Kevin, moving on to self-employment and entrepreneurship in general, how do we perform as a region?
Pretty patchily, I think. That's the point. Again, the data are not as convincing as we'd like them to be. And when we look at the region overall, there seem to be as many companies disappearing as there are being set up, which is not terribly encouraging. But it does vary tremendously within the region. And in terms of the sorts of projects that we're seeing tentatively making applications to the city deal, one of the things that I've been encouraged by is that there is quite a wide range of potential projects in which we could be investing. We are seeing signs of entrepreneurialism amongst the local business community, and indeed that was something that came out of the initial report and the evidence taking when we were pulling the Growth Commission's report together back in 2016. There is a little bit of a buzz in parts of the region in terms of business growth and employment creation.
And Rhys, what key messages would you give to anyone thinking about starting their own business in the region?
I think the important message to give is that there is a very good, strong skill base here to grow your business once you've got it established. I think we are in the top quarter of core cities in the UK in terms of people at level 4 or above in terms of their skill abilities, so a lot of graduates, for example. I think what we now need to do is ensure that they are employed and deployed at the level where we get extract the maximum value out of them. They're arguably underdeployed at the moment. So if you come in and set up your own business and you've got a vibrant idea, I think there is a good place here to grow your business going forward from a skills perspective. As Kevin alluded to earlier on, the cost base is low. Again, that is an advantage in your early days of starting up a business. You keep your overheads down. It is a small region. It's not that difficult to transverse from one area to another. It's well networked. I think the connectivity to London is improving with the train infrastructure and the metro infrastructure within the region. We've still got some way to go on the digital connectivity, but that is a priority for us as a city deal, and that is being addressed. So I would say, bear with us. We're on the right track there. So I think that the conditions for entrepreneurship and growing your business are encouraging.
Could you compare that with other regions of the UK when it comes to that entrepreneurship, that business support that's available? There
is some data out there, but as Kevin alluded to, the data is not as robust as it should be. I think business support is always a challenge when you've got such diversity in your business community. How do you support them? And getting a generic business support service isn't quite the answer, I think. And I think we do, from our perspective as a city deal, we've got key sectors that we wish to target. And I think we will be looking for some tailored business support for those areas, and it will be horses for courses in terms of what that will look like. I think the other area that we do need to consider is our wider business community, because not a vast proportion of our business community will be in those key sectors. So there's a lot outside that, and I think a key challenge is how do we support those businesses effectively.
What about breaking down, I suppose, the levels of entrepreneurship? So you've got those guys who have got a good idea but have no clue how to start a business. You've got the startups who've got a great idea and have never run a business. And then you've got the smaller SMEs that are looking to scale. Is there any evidence or any information around those three different areas?
Not that I know of in great detail, but what we are seeing, in particular in Cardiff, is the emergence of a number of incubators and accelerators to support business startups. So there is a demand there. The banks are helping with this. There's a lot of space and expertise being deployed to it. So I think, addressing your point about people with good ideas not knowing how to take them forward, some of that network is now in place. I think we now need to ensure that those businesses that do start have the support to grow where they have the opportunity to grow, and also look to replicate that support in other parts of the region.
Kevin, how do we fare with regards to the ability to provide a steady stream of skilled resources into our business communities?
I think from the point of view of higher education, we're very well based, actually. We've got several very good universities. The thing that strikes me about them as academic establishments too is that compared to many of the ones I'm familiar with, most familiar with, they're very keen to engage commercially with business. They're very keen to make sure that the subjects, the way that they teach these subjects, that they're relevant to the local business community, and they're very flexible in terms of being willing to adapt their curriculum to reflect that. So I think higher education-wise, I think the region is pretty well served. Perhaps where it's a little bit patchier, again, as we touched on earlier, is when you come to the level of vocational skills, where again, it varies tremendously. You've got some pockets where there are still, sadly, too many people without any formal qualification at all. And I think that's probably where the room to improve things is most visible, and where ideally policymakers will be focusing their attention.
I think, as Kevin alluded to, the region is well stocked with universities that are keen to engage in this agenda. There's a lot of work that they're doing, but I think equally important is the 5 further education colleges that we have. They train more 16 to 19-year-olds than all of the sixth form schools in the region. So there's a vast quantity of individuals and skills there that we need to maybe think about a bit more strategically and look at the skills elevator in the pipeline, growing out of our schools into the colleges and further on to universities, and more importantly into business. And I think as a city region, we have a regional skills partnership that tries to convene some of this work. There's more to be done, and I think having a clear focus on the requirements of our key sectors going forward, but also on that wider manufacturing and wider foundational economy is important, because there's the number of jobs is significant there, and I think it is really important to state that it's this is not a competition between the high tech companies and the foundational economy. Both of those need to work in conjunction with each other. They feed each other. They hand in glove, and not as a competition of where does policy influence most go at the moment. And I think we have suffered a little bit historically of that pendulum swinging back and forth between those areas.
I think that's a very important point. And remember, the competitiveness we're talking about here is not the competitiveness within the region of one industry against another. It's how the region itself compares to the rest of the economy and the wider world.
Okay, final question to you both, starting with yourself, Rhys. All this data is obviously fantastic. How are you planning to use it in terms of the context of City Deal activity?
I think this data, as I said right at the outset, is really hopefully a baseline for us of where we are as a City Deal today, looking at it across the broad range of activity that we need to not be too narrow on the economic case, but also look at the wider transport, digital connectivity, social, environmental deprivation indices and so on. So we do take things in the round instead of just focusing solely on our key KPIs as a City Deal. So that's how we're going to plan to use it and going forward. But how will we use that in practice? Well, this data, as it evolves, will be a key element of how we assess some of our investments going forward. How will our investment propositions we're considering help us move the needle, for example, on some of the challenges that the data set currently poses?
Massive amounts of data. I mean, any actual physical things on the ground that you guys are doing to manage that data and to move that forward?
Yes, so we are working in partnership with Cardiff University with colleagues, Professor Jill Bristow and Professor Max Monday, to name two. There's a few others as well. Looking at this, we're recruiting 2 PhD students to work with them to provide some of that capacity so we can take this forward and add a degree more intelligence and insight into the data we've got currently.
Kevin, how are we going to keep the data up to date and I guess in front of mind?
Well, that's a great question. One of the frustrations in using regional economic data is that it's often patchy and it's often out of date. So some of the figures that we've had to use in the report actually are several years old. Now, the City Deal and others like it across the UK, we're a customer for the data provider here, and we need these data. And ideally, going forwards, our demands are going to ensure that there is more of this data in a more timely fashion being made available than is the case at the moment. Because, as Rhys was saying, we have to see how we're doing. And we can't see how we're doing if the data are so old that they are not able to tell us.
And that brings us to the end of this podcast. Rhys, Kevin, thanks very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mark.